we loop back with all those young people who said they wanted to remain engaged in the process. And almost about 100 young people said they wanted to be engaged in understanding sort of what we learned about what would it take. And then the last phase of the process was being drafted, the what would it take report with young people. And so this gives you an idea of the cross-section of where we were engaged across Canada. And so a good representation from across Canada, as well as northern communities, large urban centers, smaller centers as well that were important. We know that in Canada, that much like anywhere else, I guess, the response to youth homelessness in large urban centers is much different than the response to youth homelessness in small rural or small urban centers. And so we were pleased to be able to ensure that young people from all those spaces were engaged in it. And these were the questions. And again, these were opportunities. Again, we designed the questions, we designed this facilitated dialogue, and worked with our providers to be able to host these, I would call them relatively intimate and engaged conversations with young people around what would have prevented your experience from homelessness, what kinds of programs and services would help homeless young people, who should be involved in preventing homelessness, and what were the big key takeaways from young people around what the government should know around youth homelessness prevention. And so out of that, again, sort of keeping in mind that we were entering into this place around this roadmap for the prevention of youth homelessness. And I won't talk about the roadmap very much in this presentation, but really the roadmap ended up being a social policy framework for Canadian governments at large around the components that are necessary for youth homelessness prevention. And so what we landed on, thankfully, with the support of these young people, is what is homelessness prevention and what falls into that category. And again, that was much of the rich dialogue that we had afterwards around sort of the content and the feedback from young people is drilling down on what this definition was. But what we also had the opportunity to do is identify what it wasn't. And that was really important as well, because as we know, much like with anything else, and we've seen this certainly with practice models in Canada, many people in Canada would say, yes, we're doing housing first for youth. But as you drill down, you work through the core principles of housing first for youth, what we realize is that they're just really providing supportive housing. So much like this, lots of community organizations and governments would say, yes, we're into the business of youth homelessness prevention, but at the end of the day, they aren't. And so definitionally, the former bureaucrat in me, I spent 15 years in government, appreciates the clarity that a definition provides. What it also provides is who is involved in the components and the realities with respect to youth homelessness prevention and what's at play here. And so what we also learned from young people is that there are elements around structural prevention, systems prevention, and these relational individual components of prevention that happen for young people that aren't systems-based, but are also the opportunities for us to intervene early and to work further upstream and to not miss opportunities to engage with young people when their risk is really high. And so overall, these were sort of the galvanizing learnings from young people. And the top one is the most galvanizing, is that all these young people who were part of the consultations had varying degrees of experiences of homelessness, but they were all very clear in that the collective we, whether it be small systems, community organizations, government systems, are waiting far too long to intervene with young people. In many ways, we're expecting young people to kind of bootstrap themselves out of homelessness, and we know that won't happen. What we also learned was that there are system failures, and more so than system failures, there are missed opportunities and missed intersections for young people. They cited many of these kinds of examples of school experiences where visibly not well, and not well for a while, but still remaining engaged in school. And so the signs were there, but then nothing happened. And so again, all of these kinds of realistic stories and these experiences that young people shared with us gave us a better sense of how we then would approach, again, with this roadmap in mind, how we approach these big components with respect to large-scale systems change, system reform, new policy opportunities, but then also these structural elements around colonialism, equity and discrimination, diversity, professional conduct. Many young people said that organizations weren't equipped and weren't trained and didn't have the right kind of training to support young people who were presenting with the kinds of risk factors that they were. So what does that mean? And again, that piece of work has shaped Away Home Canada's sort of next steps in the work, and I can get into that a bit later. But then also what we learned, and I mean, I was the first one to confess that we had gone far enough down the roadmap conversation without engaging young people that I felt like we failed them in a way. And so really the roadmap had to be scrapped. And we built it from the ground up moving forward. And so this is the roadmap. Again, it's, like I said, it's a gigantic read. It's about 120 pages. Again, it's a social policy framework for all levels of government that focused on these 6 areas of youth homelessness prevention. The 6th one being, culminating in what we would hope Canada moves forward with respect to duty to assist. That's an awful image, probably really blurry on your end. It's blurry on mine. But what does structural prevention look like? What does systems prevention look like? What is early intervention? What falls into that? What's evictions prevention, and what is housing stabilization? And so this also has been able to we can concretely now have these conversations with government, whether that be our municipal governments, provincial or territorial governments, or the federal governments, and have these a bit more pointed conversations with them about where they fit in. And what this also meant was that we found where there were implications for policy and programs across Canada. And so in many ways, our federal government provides overall leadership or the framework for ending homelessness in Canada. And what that means is that provincial and territorial governments have a requirement or a responsibility to somewhat align with the federal government's focus or priorities with respect to youth homelessness prevention or homelessness at large. And so what this meant that we were able to sort of shape this conversation federally, provincially, and municipally, and allow themselves to see themselves within the content that was developed. And know that they didn't have to be all things to all people, all levels of government, but they needed to demonstrate a level of integration across these number of levels of government to ensure that there was some sort of harmonized approach to the issue of homelessness in general. And what it also meant was that we had this framework for how to call government systems in. And that young people cited many experiences where, and this is likely the case internationally, where young people's transitions from larger systems went relatively okay for a short period of time, and then that okay experience turned bad, and they had no other opportunities to move into something else. And so that meant that our community organizations were left to pick up the pieces of young people whose poor transitions weren't facilitated. And so whether that be transition from child intervention, mental health supports, justice, health in general, these many systems weren't necessarily as dovetailed as they should be. And what it meant that we were able to sort of identify their key roles in ensuring that there were opportunities for them to work together, realizing that they were working with the same young people. But what it also meant was we were able to give our community organizations a bit of a roadmap as well, and allowing them to have a bit better advocacy point on the issue of youth homelessness prevention and where they saw themselves. In many ways, we ask our government systems to be better organized. And that is okay, because government systems are inherently terribly unorganized, and they're siloed and they're disconnected. But from the lens of me being in government, and I led government work around youth homelessness prevention for about 7 years, my assessment was that community wasn't as well organized as they should be as well. And so what does that mean around organizing themselves so that they can also support government to organize itself as well? And so it also suggested too that we needed to ground our work in human rights. And now we have a much better picture of that. And we have a national housing strategy that focuses on housing as a human right. And again, some of that work was embedded within and took signals from our work. We also needed to be able to ensure that our frontline service providers had the training they need. And so that's the next step of Away Home Canada. So the sort of the legacy of our training and technical assistance work kind of goes back to 2018, where young people were very clear about the fact that these people who were working with them didn't have the proper kinds of training to be able to support harm reduction approaches, trauma-informed care, enhancing sort of the need for family and natural supports, these focus around, diversity and inclusion, specifically tailored responses to young people who represent different population groups. So again, all of these, again, I can't tell you enough that the work that we did around what would it take provided us with this much clearer picture of how we then work all together. So again, this is, we've changed our language over the last number of years, and that we shake our fist at government systems and tell them why they aren't being better. Our approach now is to call them into the conversation. Because again, we have a much better vision and much clearer opportunity to be able to have really detailed and crisp conversations with government systems about their role and their role in partnership with the youth homelessness sector. And that as that sector is organizing itself, we also need to see where government and large scale systems can better understand themselves. That's it. Open to questions.
Thanks, David. If anybody has questions, they can throw them into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and ask a question directly if you want. I might just kick things off and maybe coming back more to the involvement of young people. Were there any major lessons you learned in the process of involving the young people in how you went about doing the research? I think one of the biggest fears organizations have is that you do it in a tokenistic way. And how did you avoid tokenizing the voices of young people and make sure that it was, I guess, done in a meaningful way, but it was really heard and something was done with it? I can think of lots and lots of examples of where people have included young people in the beginning, but actually at the end of the process, it kind of came back to, what do the adults really think, or the people with the professional experiences rather than the young people themselves?
Yeah, Caitlin and I were pretty realistic about what this might mean from a resource side, but what we were entering into if we did truly want to engage them in a full process. And it was we knew it was going to be a heavy lift, and it was much heavier than we thought because young people wanted to remain so engaged. And so that was a big lesson learned for me, was that we expected it to be a high resource implication, and it was much higher than we thought because of the interest levels from young people. And so I think also was comforting in that we had developed the right kinds of tools for the community organization to lead this work on our behalf. And again, every young person who was part of the consultation received an honorarium. And then they received honorariums as we rolled along as well. So if they wanted to remain engaged in the design of the report and the sort of the collapsing of the feedback and collating of the priorities, they were engaged in that. They were also engaged in the refinement of the report, and those who were engaged in the national consultation were provided with an honorarium. And all of that work was funded under a large-scale foundation that we have in Canada called the Home Depot Canada Foundation. And so they saw the value in ensuring that young people were engaged throughout the process. And so that was a big learning for me. I guess the other big learning too is, I think many people are, I wasn't, but many people are like, oh, are we prepared to hear what we're going to hear?
Yes.
I guess, and again, to your point, Robbie, are we really prepared to do something with this? and not censor it and not strip it down to what's going to be palatable for government. And what we got from young people was really realistic stuff. And it was really grounded in really real perspectives that had a thread within each of them that pointed at specific opportunities that we could leverage. And so they never asked for anything that was out to lunch. They didn't ask for anything that was going to be too much for us to handle, which again was a learning for me as well. In that I always trust young people in that process. But again, we also wrestled with this. When do you speak to young people? And was it best to speak to young people who had transitioned from their experience of homelessness so they could then look back at it with a different lens? Or was it better to speak to young people who were in that moment? And our decision was to speak to them in that moment because we knew that they had a connection back to the organization we were working with. So if things came up for them, there was that constant for them they could go back to and again, validate what they were feeling and if this triggered something, because we knew sometimes those questions would. And so I think that was the right decision as well. And we've since engaged with young people who have transitioned or exited homelessness in a different mechanism. So we've got a couple other layers of engagement that happen with young people, one of them being a Scholars with Lived Experience network. But I think that was overall the right decision. And we took the right approach with engaging with young people where they were at.
I think actually that's the kind of question mark over like, what are they going to ask for? And are they going to put in recommendations that are too, I don't know, like outlandish or out there? It kind of echoes back to when we started working on Housing First for Youth and the idea of youth voice, choice, self-determination, that young people would be asking for the impossible. And I actually think in the vast majority of cases that doesn't actually happen at all. So you mentioned resources were very important, and having an honorarium or a system to which young people are paid for their contribution and their work, and that they're given some sort of a scope to continue in the process for as long as they want to shape the product, or if they wish to leave, they can also leave.
Yeah.
You also mentioned tools that you made available. So you kind of said that you're kind of at the observatory at a very kind of out there level, and you created tools that were for organizations on the ground who had the relationship and the trust built with young people. Could you talk us through some of those?
Yeah. So
and then we'll come to the questions in the chat.
Yeah. So beyond the questions, we kind of provided some promising or best practice for focus groups. And so all of the organizations, we also have this body that we engage with on a regular basis. It's our national learning community. And it's a member community of about 38 organizations across Canada who are all sort of steeped in this work. They're all engaging with the work at some different level. And so we relied on those organizations to engage with young people. And so beyond the questions and the facilitated dialogue and sort of these probing opportunities beyond the core questions, we hosted a webinar with all those organizations who had committed to hosting these consultation sessions, and again, walked them through the process. And again, that was our way of, and again, we were available to them leading up to them. We were available to them if they wanted to do it with our support. We could make ourselves available. And it was pre-COVID days, so you actually could travel, but we didn't need to. But we opened that opportunity up. But again, it was really quite interesting in that, the selfish part of me wished I could be on a fly on every single one of those walls, because I know that there was likely dialogue that we missed because you just couldn't capture everything. And, the whites of the eyes of young people, I think that's really important as we understand the dynamics of this work. But, we also provided organizations with kind of I can share this stuff afterwards, sort of the tip sheets of what it might mean to, if you get a young person who's opposed to it and they don't want to continue to participate, how could you engage with them offside or disconnected from the larger group? So it was more so than anything, again, providing them with the tools that they needed to be able to engage in those kind of the rich dialogue that we thought was going to happen. What was interesting, and I see the question here about subpopulation groups, was that the organizations that we were working with, again, probably didn't get as deeply into those subpopulations that we would have hoped. We know that there was Indigenous representation. We know that there was representation from young people who were LGBTQS. From some of our larger centers, there was young people who identified as racialized, so new immigrant communities. But we know that likely there needed to be an opportunity if we were to do it again, and this is a learning, I guess, is being a bit more deliberate with how we engage with those populations if we were to do this again, because it was something that we were relying, again, that's part of the risk too, is that we were relying on organizations to be able to pull these young people in, and certainly didn't have any requirements about those demographics, but we didn't get the kind of representation on that side as we would have hoped.
Okay. Paul, I can see you have your webcam on. Do you want to ask your question or comment? Or I can read it out. Perfect.
It's more of an observation. It's quite interesting that we're still taking a systems, or as I call it, the adult perspective towards the research. You mentioned, David, it took you a while to figure out to involve youth within the research. So if you think of the key participant, I'm more worried or concerned that still in terms of homelessness, we always look at it from a systems perspective. And if you do take an ecological view, the participant is the person you're serving at the center. They should be it's just interesting as to why it took the system of ages to realize, well, who are we talking about here? Youngsters, then we should be asking them. Because if you take a youth work model, that collaborative approach of participatory research is smack bang in the middle of it. But it's just interesting that a homeless piece of research tends to come from more systemic, what's the big system around this? Whereas if you look at, well, actually we are systems, so young people first, it's more of an interesting observation from a researcher's brain here. And also for someone who manages youth services, that the people we serve are smack bang in the middle. Why was it that you felt it took his ages to realize that? Sorry, a bit of a convoluted way to get there.
Yeah, I think we knew that the roadmap was going to be a bit of a divining rod for us. And we knew that entering into the conversation and sort of putting our foot down because really Away Home Canada and the Canadian Observatory are advocacy organizations. As much as they're research focused, as much as they're practice, policy, and planning related, we're advocacy organizations. And so we needed, so as we thought about putting our foot down, we knew that going back to 2016 to the Without a Home National Youth Survey, we had young people who were engaged in that survey process who gave us that picture. But again, that picture was a relatively generic, scripted survey process that gave us tons of demographic tools, but it didn't give us any narrative. And as we thought about, again, this putting foot down opportunity around the roadmap, we knew that we had actually missed the point around understanding, again, where these missed intersections were, and that you couldn't gather that from a survey process. And we knew that also we were hearing from this national learning community that I was telling you about. They were hearing from young people on a regular basis about their experiences, and we were missing out on that. And so instead of taking the organization's word for it around these are their experiences, we felt like as the advocacy organization, it was going to sort of put their name to an opportunity. We need to know also that we had a level of credibility and a level of assurance that this was the direction that young people were in favor of as well. And so I don't want anybody to think that the 2018 What Would It Take report was our first opportunity to engage young people, but it was our first opportunity to really drill down with them around policy, practice, and planning solutions that we could continue to sort of advocate for and advocate with young people. So we've had many engagement opportunities, but nothing that was this centered on their experiences.
Thanks very much, David. And actually, one of the presentations tomorrow from Denmark is going to be highlighting how they've started to do that process in a Danish context, making it a bit more systematic rather than it being a one-off kind of approach, which sometimes happens when engaging with youth. Kirsten, I can see your webcam is also on if you want to ask your question, or I can read it out, totally up to you. Oh, perfect.
That's fine. I can ask a question. Yeah, one of the challenges I've faced, I've not actually done much young person collaboration for a while, sort of maternity leave and changing of job roles and things. But what we used to find was kind of the opposite from what you were saying, David, which is sometimes engagement is really hard. And partly because we're working with young people who experience a lot of trauma, mental health, have a chaotic lifestyle potentially. And so I've found that consistently engaging young people, even when they have quite a high motivation, can sometimes be a challenge. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Or maybe Canadian young people are slightly different from us in Scotland. But yeah, I've found the sort of nature of it can be quite up and down in terms of taking part.
Yeah, I would say, again, I mentioned the resource implication of this. It was a giant piece of work, and you develop relationships with young people in a much stronger way than I expected. And so the consultation pieces were the kind of the easy part on our end. It was the ongoing relationships and dialogue and curation of the content that was onerous. And we needed to be conscious. And that was also a really careful balance too, because that we had young people, these many young people who were coming into the conversation and ensuring we were steering this in the right way, all feeling very passionate about the things that they needed to find in the report. What was the really, really careful balance was that the language we were using reflects theirs. And I think, that we didn't get into, and I'm kind of unpacking kind of the experience in real time here. We didn't get into many of those kind of mental health concerns in the process. Our big concern was that, are we responsive enough? And are we moving this quickly enough for them? Because, they felt some urgency and they were excited about it. And how do we make sure that we didn't lose them in the process, because unfortunately we were having to do what we needed to do to write and create and design and facilitate and create comms, like all the stuff that they didn't want. We had to do behind the scenes. And so that was more so the concern for us, was that we were going to lose young people within the process. But fortunately we didn't. And so I was really quite surprised, because I did sort of prepare myself for maybe tougher conversations with young people than we ended up having. But that was an okay preparation on my part, because maybe I was more prepared for that. And again, I came from frontline service delivery. I mean, it was a generation ago, but I needed to sort of bring back some of those skill sets and tools that I developed over time to be able to ensure that young people felt like they were listened to.
One quick question from Paul before we hand over to Anthony is: did you use peer researchers in the work?
There were, in a couple of the sites we have this Scholars with Experience network. So young people who transitioned out of homelessness, who are now completing either a master's or a PhD. In a couple of the sites, they were present to be able to host those consultations in partnership with the organization, because they were already linked with the organization. So there was those experiences. We've also had peer researchers engaged in other types of survey opportunities. So that 2016 Without a Home National Youth Survey happened again in 2019. And we utilized peer researchers in that experience as well. And then we're also using peer researchers within our Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project research work. And so we've got it, we're steeped in that. We were early on in that work. And so I can't say that all consultations included a peer researcher, but I would say about 25% did. And that the richness of the dialogue that came out of those ones was higher than the others. I'll say that.
Perfect. And would it be okay to perhaps get some of the tip sheets that you mentioned earlier and some of the tools? If you can send them on to me, I can send them around to all the participants afterwards as part of the follow-up. I say this all the time when I'm on to Steve and Mel. I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel, and where these resources exist and where possible to share them around, if that's okay.
Yeah, we can recycle anything, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
I'm going to move over now to Anthony and Krista from True Colours United, who are going to present a little bit on the work that they do around youth collaboration. And maybe not to put you on the spot starting out, Anthony, but we actually had a call a few weeks ago about this training. And at the time, I was coming at it from a youth participation was the label that we were using. And after a call with you and Coco, we decided to go with youth collaboration. So actually, maybe as a starting point, you can speak to why the language that we use around this work is also important.
Yeah, of course. As we know, with all community work, especially with marginalized people, language is very important. We want to make sure that we set ourselves up to empower ourselves to empower others. So participation, we see it as more passive, whereas collaboration is an opportunity to make sure that we're including young people in this work. How's that, Krista? Good. I'll start by sharing our screen.
Perfect. Great. I can see the screen.
Perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anthony Ratosa. My pronouns are he, him, his, or any pronouns that it's respect. I'm a social work intern at True Colours United. And Krista.
Hi, folks. I'm Krista. I use she, her pronouns, and a senior director at True Colours United, based in the States. So just a quick background on what it is that we do. So True Colours United does work around LGBTQ youth homelessness at the national level. And we do that through a number of program areas. The first one being training and education, technical assistance, where our main constituents in that program area are service providers and communities. So we're working to educate folks to make sure that they have a baseline knowledge on LGBTQ issues, as well as youth collaboration philosophies. The next program area is advocacy, where we do a mixture of both local and federal based advocacy on issues that affect both homelessness and housing and LGBTQ issues. So we kind of like straddle those two issue areas. And then our last program area is we call youth action. And Robbie already mentioned how important language is in this work. And this program area actually used to be called youth collaboration. It's now called youth action. And we can talk a little bit more about like why we switched that language as well. But I'll just add that young people are constantly changing the way that they talk about themselves, both in the like as the LGBTQ community. And so in order to like keep up with how folks are continuing to talk about themselves and how language is progressing, we've changed the name of this program area a number of times. But this program area is specific to how the young people engage in our work. And so this includes the National Youth Forum on Homelessness, which is a national body of young people that inform the work with all of our national partners, as well as in the federal government. So they have a lot of those kinds of opportunities, collaboration opportunities. And then we also have a couple of networks for local youth action boards to engage in our work. That's more of us helping them kind of like create sustainability and get set up and stuff like that. Less of them informing our work.
Great. Right. So before we get into adultism, defining adultism, and unpacking that a little more, I want to introduce a few things that we recommend a little more concrete that you can do to avoid barriers as adult partners in this work to authentic youth collaboration. So the first might be the most obvious step, but it's to authentically engage in youth collaboration by building trust. Trust is definitely the foundation of this work. And as we all know, it's not built overnight. It requires transparency, accountability, consistency, and a trauma-informed approach. It's important to remember not to rush trust with young people, so move at the speed of trust, and also keep the end in mind in the beginning of planning a program, planning a collaboration with you. So really keep in mind that the direction that you're going to go. So you're building trust throughout. Next, we have meaningful engagement. So as opposed to showy engagement, which is a form of tokenism, as David was talking about earlier, actually, we want to consider how young people are invited to participate, right? So are they provided opportunities to share their vision for transformational systems, or are they only invited to speak around their trauma, perhaps for fundraising? So we want to avoid this tokenism and move toward meaningful. Next, we have autonomy. So we want to make sure that young people, we know that young people are experts on their own experience, and we trust that they know what's best for themselves. So we want to avoid a paternalistic ideology. We want to provide support in whatever ways in decision-making, rather than attempting to exert control over young people. And with this, in the next point, we're going to see how these are all really connected. So sharing power is next. Whenever possible, we want to make sure that youth hold power in decision-making, especially regarding these things that affect them directly. So we're looking for and creating opportunities for sharing power, such as adding young people to a board or other leadership bodies. The point is, we want to make sure that youth have actual power. They're not just sharing their thoughts on homelessness, but they have voting power where it matters. And finally, as we discussed briefly as well, compensation. So this is hard work, and young people definitely deserve to be compensated for their contributions, same as adult partners in this work. So their lived experience within systems is specifically and extremely valuable. It needs to be respected and honored. So we want to make sure that we're ensuring that young people get paid a fair wage. And to make sure that we do that, we want to make sure that we're budgeting for it in our annual budgets. Again, make sure we see the end and the goals in the beginning of planning programs and projects. We also like to say pizza is not payment, and gift cards cannot open bank accounts or create financial stability. So these are important things to keep in mind.
Great, thanks, Anthony. So adultism is probably an idea that like folks are less familiar with, and it is constantly showing up in the work of authentic youth engagement. Adultism describes a system of privileged attitudes and behaviors that adults have over young people. So an example might be making decisions for youth and young adults because of the assumption that they're not able to make them themselves. There's lots of assumptions that adults make about young people's like abilities or capabilities that kind of like entitle them to act upon or on behalf of young people, sometimes without their agreement or consent. Go ahead to the next slide. Great. So ageism is something that maybe folks are more familiar with, but it's, you know, the idea of like stereotyping and discriminating against people on the basis of their age. And this often shows up in like elder adults that like younger people have kind of like privileged attitudes and behaviors over elders. I think the like a really good example of this is kind of like with technology, right? After spending, you know, majority of my Sunday kind of like troubleshooting things with my grandma on her computer, like this is very, very front and center for me. But adultism is a form of ageism, and it's just the opposite. It's kind of like these ideas and behaviors that adults have over young people in the same way. Adultism shows up in common language in a number of different ways. I've already talked about how it could show up in terms of like, you know, making decisions for young people because maybe they don't, you know, you think they can't make them themselves. It shows up in common language in terms of like respecting your elders, or maybe I'm older and wiser, or they're just being childish or immature. The idea that children should be seen and not heard, or they should stay in their place. Other common examples include like the more you live, the more you know, stuff like that. And it shows up like in this work of kind of like identifying and undoing adultism, like in ourselves at True Colors United, in order to do this work better. It like really permeates like our language and our thought and like how we engage the work. Next slide. So the idea to in order to like do authentic youth collaboration or engagement authentically, you have to start to unlearn adultism, replace it with new ideas, take action against oppression. So speak up when you see it happening or when it's happening in yourself. And remember, we've all been the oppressed, the oppressor, and the ally. And I'll just add to that the harmful effects of adultism, such as power imbalances and lack of trust that that Anthony was talking about earlier, they directly prohibit authentic youth engagement. And you cannot practice authentic youth engagement without unlearning and undoing adultism. That's like step one. And it is just like any other kind of like unlearning, you know, social justice work. It's constant. You have to constantly be unlearning it, identifying it, reframing it, always. Next slide. Great. So we can go through this scenario really quick and then launch into a little bit of discussion around the scenario and answer any questions that folks might have.
So here we have our scenario. A group of youth with lived experience of homelessness has been assembled to provide feedback on how to improve services in their community. They're asked to only speak about ways to improve basic direct services and not how to address systemic issues within the services in their community. So we're wondering, how does this hit y'all? How does this impact authentic youth collaboration? Why is this inequitable for young people with lived experience?
Okay, so some audience participation. I think maybe the best thing to do would be to unmute yourself, and if you have something to add.
It doesn't honour or value their actual experience and story about asking them to only provide information or ideas on one specific bit, particularly when systemic issues are known to be the root of a lot of these problems. Anyways, it's kind of like, well, we don't want to deal with that. We don't want to change that. So it's very tokenistic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Kristen. It's almost like the idea that like, oh, the systems work is like too big and too like we can't get into that. And it also like really limits how young people are like, if we're inviting them to share like their visions for the future, then it's like we can really like expand our ideas, even our ideas of what we think the solutions are to this issue, right? And I will also say that it's like very transactional, right? It's like the scenario here is like you have to give us this, and we don't want to hear about anything else, and so it turns into a very transactional relationship rather than like a reciprocal one.
Wonder, does anybody else have any other thoughts on this scenario? All right, shall we move on?
Yeah, wondering, yeah, that's kind of like the end of our introduction to authentic youth collaboration, authentic youth engagement. Wondering if folks have questions or other scenarios that they want to throw out into the group. Happy to kind of like troubleshoot any issues that folks are having around this. I will say that in this work, we have learned and are continuing to learn so much, and happy to talk more about it and dive deeper into it.
So do you want to explain this picture real quick?
Yeah, this is the National Youth Forum on Homelessness. So I talked about how it was a national youth-led body. These are the folks that are in it. And so we meet on a regular basis. They inform our work. They have their whole, they work on a policy agenda that is specific to the forum. They have trainings, and they work directly with some of the more local young people to engage them in the work locally and train them. So. And these are our resources that we have on this issue. The first one being a youth collaboration toolkit that's for service providers specifically, and is like a great introductory resource into doing this work. And then we also have our youth action toolkit, which is a resource specifically for young people. It goes into a lot of kind of like homelessness systems. It's a great place for young people to start out in doing this work, and would be kind of like a great guide for specifically other countries in thinking about engaging, like what kind of information do young people need in order to engage in the work authentically, because there's a lot of like training and learning that they have to do, that was mentioned earlier, around like language and stuff like that. In the US, we use a lot of acronyms that are like ridiculous, honestly. And so there's just like a lot of training around what the heck those acronyms even mean that we have to start out with.
Yeah, and we can share this link to these toolkits in the chat as well.
Perfect, and we can include the links in the follow-up information to the training as well, in addition to the presentation, so that everybody can have access to all the information. I mean, if anyone has questions, you can feel free to throw them out into the chat box or to raise your hand and to take the floor. I had a first question. It's just escaped me because I never wrote it down. Mistake number one of moderating. It's totally gone for me now. I'm having such a Monday blank. If anyone else wants to jump in. Well, that was it. For the scenario that you had presented on the slide, could you talk us through some of the inequities that you would have seen in that situation?
Yeah, for sure. So we might have seen inequities in kind of like limiting the expression that young people have. And so if we're inviting them to only speak about one certain kind of like, we're kind of like, the scenario kind of was like, stay in this lane. And while we do want to make sure that that folks aren't that folks are like staying on issue, we don't want to limit them to like, here's what the world could look like. When we open up the question like that, it allows folks to get like more creative. And like I said, for it to like even permeate kind of like our ideas of what the solutions to the issues looks like when they're being like as creative as they possibly can. And a lot of times, as folks who have been doing the work, as adults who have been doing the work for a really long time, our ideas of the solutions are rooted in like those systems that the young people are saying do not work, right? And so in order to kind of like get them to think more creatively, we can open it up and say like, what's your vision of the future? What does a world look like in which youth homelessness doesn't exist, or something like that?
Because on reflection, when I think about it, I also wonder, it comes back to something that David mentioned earlier, when you say you task people with asking young people for their experiences, do you risk not getting a very representative group of young people as well? I think it's one of the big issues I find working in homelessness in general, is that often governments talk about vulnerable people and marginalized groups, and we speak in such abstract terms that we never really understand who we're speaking about and get into the specific needs. And so is that something as well that I think David said, going back, they would be a bit more detailed on who were perhaps underrepresented groups that they wanted to have included, like Indigenous groups, maybe young women, maybe LGBTIQ, maybe young migrants, in a European context, maybe young Roma. Is that something that you would include?
Yeah, for sure. And like, this is like you're mentioning, Robbie, like this is going to be specific to like your like your country and the history of in your country. Like in our country, it's mostly like black and brown folks, LGBTQ folks, as well as some other things that I might include in there is like folks engaged in sex work, stuff like that. So you want to have like a more understanding of the issue locally, and also make sure that you're engaging with those communities in this work, which also like might affect how they're able to engage. And so going back to like the question that Kirsten asked in the chat earlier about like folks experiencing like trauma or mental health or a chaotic lifestyle, that's something that like we have and are continuing to experience to this day, and we're constantly having to shift how we're engaging folks in the work. And so what that could look like is making sure that folks are compensated, making sure that they're set up for success in terms of like the training that they're receiving, making sure that they have the language and the knowledge to be able to show up to the table in an authentic way. Sometimes that means compensating like emotional labor. And so like if someone's like, I just need like to be able to take care of myself, I need to see a therapist, for example, because I have this like I just had this like traumatic experience and I need to talk about it with someone. like those are types of things that we actually just included in this year's budget, to have a therapist on retainer, because we're experiencing a lot of like folks needing that kind of support. And so we're able to connect them with a therapist and pay for it. And so just thinking outside the box in terms of like what this work means, and what like health and wellness and stability looks like, and how we can continue to facilitate that.
Michael, I saw you had your hand raised. You lowered it, but I'll offer you the floor anyway, because your webcam is still on.
Hi, this is Michael. I'm a care leaver from Czech Republic, and I'm part of one small care leavers group. And one thing that came to my mind when I saw the photo was, well, what kind of situation are those young people in? Because like I know myself that chaos in someone's life, in life of one of our members, would make practically the member, unable to participate meaningfully in any work. There's one member or two members, we still have, and who still live this like very chaotic life. They often are not even able or willing to engage. So I was wondering, what kinds of situations are these young people in, and what can you really offer them? Like, can you even offer them if for example, housing, or is it something that they are told right from the beginning that that you cannot provide them with? You can maybe connect them or tell them about organizations who will help them with that, but like you are unable to do all kinds of things for them. But money, therapists, or some other kinds of like compensations are possible. That's like what I was wondering about, because if they, quite often young people, me including, we didn't have enough information, maybe didn't have clear idea of what's possible and what's not. Sometimes we would forget. Sometimes we would have conversations between ourselves, not with the adults from the organizations. So we would start, theorizing about all kinds of things, and like, then we would have some like expectations which wouldn't be met, so like, I would be just like, I'm curious what kinds of things, like concrete specific things, compensations you are providing them at the moment, and like how do you communicate with them about these compensations?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's really important in this work to also have really strong boundaries, and talking and being like very clear and transparent about what we can do and what we can't do. And so we engage in conversations around compensation the same way that we would engage any contractor. So they get an hourly wage, they get paid a certain number of hours, for a certain number of hours every month. And we're very clear, open, and transparent about how that hourly wage is calculated. And it's based on a number of different formulas that are, like housing formulas and living wage formulas and stuff like that. And then we also, like, folks are in like a number of different like mental health, housing, traumatic experience situations. And so in addition to like the therapist on retainer, that we just recently implemented. We also implemented, and actually Coco was the one that was like, this is what we need to do, who was supposed to give this presentation today, who I think most of y'all are more familiar with. We included money for hotel vouchers for folks who might be like in immediate crisis and need somewhere to stay right now, and don't have, you know, someone where they can like stay on their couch or couch surf, or, you know, a family member, anything like that they can stay with, to prevent that. That's just like a basic thing that we were able to implement to prevent them from like being on the street. And then the other thing that we also implemented this year is in the States, what we're calling direct cash transfer, which is just kind of like a pot of money that young people can access if they need it for whatever they need. If they need money to buy an outfit for a job interview, or if they need money for food for the week or something like that, it's money that they can use to pay a bill that, you know, maybe is an outstanding bill that, you know, if they don't pay it, then they lose access, like a phone bill or something like that. They would like lose access to services, to the work, to their ability to like bring in more money, or something like that. So those are a couple of like concrete things, like the therapist is one thing, the direct cash transfer is another thing, and then the hotel vouchers is another that we kind of like implemented this year. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And can I have another question? It's closely related to it. How are you as a staff like dealing with all this like heavy stuff, you know, heavy situations, and like how do you cope with that? Do you have someone on your team or someone external who helps you, you know, look you know, from afar on the situations and on the engagement, so in order to like feel better and prevent burnout and so on?
Yeah, thanks for that. This is like this role, and the staff that are specifically in the youth action, youth collaboration program area is one of our highest burnout areas, and has like the highest turnover. So I don't know that we've 100% figured that out, the right balance there. Yeah, and so we're still figuring that out. But you know, as a person who is stepping into that work, because we did have some turnover lately, I think it, you know, just from a personal experience, it's really important to have strong boundaries.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Michael, for your questions. Matea, your hand was up a moment ago. I'm going to see if you still want to take the floor. In the meantime, I'm actually just going to plug the Fianza annual conference, which is going to be in Dublin on the 3rd of June, because for the first time, we'll have a session on burnout and maintaining the mental health of frontline staff workers, which is something that is coming up more and more. So I think for those of you who are interested, I'm just going to plug that. More information on our website. But Matea, do you still want to take the floor to your question?
Yes, I would love to. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I will actually show myself as well there. So hi, and thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about, you know, talking about adultism. So coming from I come from Ljubljana Pride organization, and we're a youth LGBT organization. And so we are deeply rooted in the youth sector, and we operate within that and so on. And in that way, I have to admit that within that sector, you know, the topics of what actually Paul mentioned before, like youth participation, youth empowerment, all of these concepts are really like already for a long time existing. And most of the people working in that sector recognizes all of these values and all of these approaches that you were talking about when you were talking about this collaboration. But recently started to provide more trainings with the people who work with youth who experience homeless, especially LGBTIQ+ youth who experience homeless, and talking about adultism and, well, any of these concepts behind. We actually had quite a lot of resistance coming from the experts. And I was wondering, how did you deal with that? Or is this something that you experienced? Because I find it quite interesting. And I think this is something that is deeply intertwined with the concept of adultism, is that it's really connected with this idea of care, especially when talking with the professionals who come from so-called helping professions, right? And so I have to admit that I was quite astonished by that. And I really wonder if you have any of these challenges in your context, so any resistance or any challenges that you find when you, I don't know, provide trainings or any education and talk about the adultism in practice. Thank you.
Yeah, Anthony, you were shaking your head. Did you? Okay. Yeah, I mean, we absolutely run into resistance around this. The same as we run into resistance around like when we do like LGBTQ trainings, right? And oftentimes it is rooted in this kind of like care, or what I would consider like savior, you know, like I'm trying to save people from themselves. And I mean, the ways that we kind of address that, I don't know that we've 100, but I don't know that we have like a great formula for that. But it is helpful in, you know, just like you would kind of like call in anyone who was any peer who was exemplifying some kind of like oppression or ism, that you would have like one-on-one conversations with them about it. And also making sure, on the flip side of that, making sure to engage the young people to and you know, giving them kind of like the information and the training to speak up when they see it. And so like the idea being that like if it's coming from a peer and it's also coming from young people and they're kind of like, you know, saying that the same thing is happening, then maybe it'll like sink in a little bit more. And so we do this same presentation and do scenarios and stuff like that with young people that we're engaging with, because oftentimes what we see with different isms and oppression is that like it is internalized, and so it takes a little bit of work to undo adultism in young people even, right? And so I would say like the more folks that are like trained on it and understand it, like I said, I don't know that we have like a specific formula for that, but it's absolutely something that shows up, and was absolutely something that showed up like very early on, like when we were trying to engage external partners in this work, the federal government, for example, a very like bureaucratic, slow moving kind of like ship, if you will. And the way that we've kind of like tried to move that ship is, you know, getting other partners on board with the philosophy. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Okay.
I see a smile and a nod, so I think that can be informative. Does anybody else have questions they want to put to Krista or Anthony? Give it another moment or two. Okay. If not, what I propose then is to go for maybe maybe we'll say maybe 8-minute break. So depending on the time zone that you're in, we'll come back at 22 the hour, and then we can decide if we want to stay in one plenary together, or we can do some breakout rooms, and we have some questions to get people to start thinking about adultism in their organizations, to think about what are some of the structural barriers to collaboration before we set up for tomorrow. So in today's session, and I thought it would be good perhaps to share what are some of the challenges that were identified in the breakout rooms in the conversation. So it might be things around common challenges that you feel were faced. It would be nice to have maybe different speakers from different groups to start with. Or alternatively, if there are like some outstanding questions that you have that come from your discussions, it would also be good to hear them either for David, Anthony, and Krista, or to feed into tomorrow's session as well. But please don't all rush at once.
I was going to say, can you hear me, Robin?
Yeah, I can.
It was a bit weird. I don't know how your session felt, but we felt stagnant for some reason there. I don't know why or what. But anyway, from our perspective, I'll throw it in because per Krista and Anthony had to hop in and hop out. Some of the stuff coming up, and I will share this a little bit, is we require a paradigm shift in our thinking, but that's not a mammoth, that's not a Mount Everest thing. It's just a slight difference in talking about to become collaborative with young people is actually bringing them into the center and actually asking them, what is it you want? This is your service. How do we serve ye? We may have a pot of money that has got outputs, outcomes, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, the service design sits with the population we serve. Otherwise, it becomes a barrier to actually serving the population because it's developed by an organization who says, well, we know this is what's needed. But once you get into that territory, then you remove innovation, because innovation sits outside the system a little bit. So we were that was the kind of conversation. Networking was another one. You need to get out there and talk to organizations that aren't necessarily in the field we're in. So there's a major amount of best practice that exists in mainstream youth services per se, but don't actually work with homeless populations because, and I'll use the example that I used I manage one service where we say we are a youth service that happens to have homeless people who come to it, not we're a homeless service that happens to have youth come to it. And that's a shift in thinking and a shift in how we work. Because homeless services tend to work individually, youth services tend to work group-wise and in groups and collaboratively. So in Ireland, we have them since 2013 with the National Quality Standards Framework for Youth Services. And the bulk of that is how you're doing skills work, skills development, soft outcomes at group level. How does the group do it? Not how do the workers do it, how do the group do it? And how are young people involved in the decision-making process? So it's actually challenging that thinking that's needed. And then to realize that we will not want to relinquish that power. We need to own that because we sit in positions of power. Whether we're a front-facing coal-face worker or sitting up at a very senior level in an organization, we hold power. So we don't want to let go of that power. And to acknowledge how the trauma that we work with can imbue itself into the system. Because what we'll do is we'll protect ourselves. We'll build rings of steel around us to prevent us feeling, so to speak. And that then will prohibit young people access this. It's a little bit like when I managed family services, I would never ask the adults what's going on in the family. I'd look at the children. They are the barometer of what's going on. So young people are the barometer of, so if you offer a youth service, there's no young people coming in, there's something off. Bar COVID-19. But I think it's a paradigm shift we need.
Mm-hmm.
So stop thinking homeless, think youth.
Yeah, pretty big shift to make. Does somebody from the other group want to share a little bit of what was said? Lisa, I saw you were going to unmute yourself a moment ago. Is there something you want to add?
Can I be honest and say that I totally forgot? I'm just after getting enraptured at what Paul is saying. I totally forgot what I was good. So clearly it was a lie or something not that important.
That's no problem.
Sorry. Actually, I've remembered. I know what I was going to say. What I was going to say is we were kind of a little bit slow to get going in our conversation as well. And I think that that's because there was so much information and food for thought from the presentation that you're still, I know for me anyway, I'm still kind of thinking about all the kind of challenges that were posed to us and all the things that were going on. So still kind of thinking that through, maybe not quite ready for a huge for where I land on some things, or are there some things that are unsettling for me, and why is that? Are they unsettling because it's new, or are they unsettling because I might have another perspective? Or so I think that there is maybe part of that quiet today is about just absorbing what we've heard and thinking about it and needing time to maybe think about it in terms of our own practice, in terms of our own country context, etc.
Yeah, I think that's totally normal. Like I said in the very, very beginning, when there's only a few people on the call just when we started, that this is a brand new topic for Fianza. And I think for most European organizations, or those working in Europe at least, it's a new area. And so hopefully I can understand maybe there's a bit of overwhelm or like processing going on. But hopefully the dust settles. And again, this training will only be the first thing that we do. It's more to assess what's going on, what can we learn from the US, Canada, tomorrow, see what's happening in Europe, and then after the end of tomorrow's session, see what perhaps is needed to follow up further. Lisa, are you in the same group as Paul? Oh, okay, even better. So we've had someone from both groups speak. Anybody else want to share? Very quiet on this Monday afternoon. Okay, then what I'll do is we can bring this call to an end, and we'll be back tomorrow at 3 same time, or 3 p.m. Central European time. For those of you who are ahead of us or behind us or way behind us in the US and Canada, if you're joining us. So same time as you joined today. And then tomorrow we'll be taking a deeper look at what's happening in Europe, taking on board what we've learned today from the US and Canada, and thinking about what are some next steps maybe that we can be taking.
Is it the same link, Robbie?
It's the same link, yes. So it's the same link, works again.
Thanks.
Perfect. Okay. Well, have a nice afternoon, everyone, and I'll see you all tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.